Picture a bustling medieval market that smells of ale, wet wool, and the sharp tang of iron. Stalls creak under bolts of cloth and barrels of salted fish. Barges nudge the quay, voices bargain in a dozen languages. Now focus on the stall nearest the center. A woman, hands stained with dye, hair tucked back, a small ledger balanced on a chest beside her. She argues the price with a visiting merchant, counts out coins, wraps the yarn with practiced fingers, and after he leaves, she locks the chest, wipes her hands, and walks down the street on business no one expects her to be conducting alone. This is not a marginal anecdote. It points to a hidden pattern across medieval towns and cloistered courtyards. Women who chose to live, work, and wield influence without the legal or social umbrella of a husband. The hidden lives of women who thrived alone without to have a man is not a tale of lonely spinsterhood. It is a story of private empires, organized sisterhoods, legal cunning, and sometimes joyous autonomy. Lives that flourished in public, then were softened, recast, and often erased by later generations. Over the next hour, we'll move from market stalls to abbey halls, from ledger margins to the courthouse steps, tracing how women made independence possible and why that independence later became a target. If you love uncovering forgotten histories, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. To understand how women could thrive alone, we have to begin with law. The medieval legal world was complicated, uneven across regions, but it contained an important category that modern readers often miss: the woman alone, the femina sola in Latin terms used by clerks and jurists. Unlike the married woman, who under many legal codes was subsumed into her husband's legal identity, an unmarried woman could in certain jurisdictions own property, sign contracts, sue and be sued, and appear before courts in her own right. Records suggest this category was not an anomaly, but a functioning legal status in many towns across Western Europe. That status, in turn, made possible the economic and civic lives we will meet. What did it mean in practice? A 14th-century merchant's letter, part of a cache of correspondence preserved in a town archive, shrugs off social astonishment with a simple line: "I sold my bolts and musters my own coin." Short, plain, and telling, a woman reporting commercial activity and income as her own. In a different handful of municipal courts, we find procedural notes that read, "Briefly, a woman alone came before the alderman," indicating that civic institutions routinely processed legal claims by women who were not married. These moments are small, but they add up. They are the fingerprints that show women were not always legally invisible. There are crucial caveats. Legal recognition of a woman's independent capacity varied by region and over time.
In some places and for some classes, especially wealthy urban widows or daughters of merchants, female autonomy had firm legal grounding. In more rural or feudal contexts, customary practices or local manorial courts might constrain women severely. Our aim is not to argue for a universal medieval feminism, but to map a recurring phenomenon. Across different institutions, women found legal routes to autonomy and exploited them with creativity. Take the market. Markets were nodes not only of trade, but of legal interaction. Price disputes, contracts for future delivery, apprenticeship agreements, and the fines levied by guilds or municipal authorities all created paperwork. Women who mastered these forms could convert daily commerce into stable wealth. Some did so as independent masters. Others kept business under the ambiguous but useful status of widow, or used proxies when law or custom required male representation. Scholars who have dug into guild rolls and notarial registers find consistent traces of women arranging credit, guaranteeing debts, and circulating goods across regions, functional roles that look in many respects like entrepreneurial activity. These were not always lone wolves. A recurring pattern is collective action and mutual support. In poor neighborhoods and elite streets alike, women organized networks that balanced risk and opportunity. Cooperatives of weavers pooled looms. Neighborhood women operated rotating saving systems to pay dowries or fund business ventures. Widows formed alliances to defend their late husband's contracts or to manage estates. These networks were not invented by later romanticizers. They appear in ledgers, in petitions to magistrates, and in the gossip preserved in letters. That said, the ways those networks were described by contemporaries, by clerics, by municipal clerks, by ecclesiastical lawyers, often carried suspicion or moralizing undertones. Female independence could be admired as thrift and industry in one record, then described as excessive pride or social disorder in another. To make this concrete, consider a few representative figures, archetypes more than unassailable biographies, though all of them have roots in surviving records. One archetype is the urban merchant matron, often recorded with names like Marjorie or Marguerite in English and French cities, who maintained a shop, contracted with foreign traders, and deployed apprentices to run production. Records indicate women in textile centers as master weavers or cloth sellers. In some port towns, they directly exported merchandise or arranged shipment through partners. Another archetype is the widow who, upon her husband's death, chose to retain control of factories or estates rather than remarry. Their choices could turn widowhood into a durable power base.
A third is the Beguine, or member of Beguine communities, women who formed semi-religious communal households combining hospitality and production, frequently in textile work, and who used communal structures to protect and amplify individual autonomy. Let's linger on that legal pivot, marriage versus singleness, because it was decisive. In many legal regimes, marriage reconfigured a woman's property rights dramatically. Under the doctrine of coverture, in regions where it applied, a married woman's legal capacity could be subsumed within her husband's. Contracts signed by the wife might require the husband's countersignature. Property might pass under the husband's control. Unmarried women, by contrast, could retain inheritance, manage dowry income, and enter contracts. That created a strange incentive structure. Marriage could mean social security but legal invisibility. Remaining single or becoming a widow could mean hardship but also legal agency. Many women consciously weighed these trade-offs. One illuminating courtroom snapshot, an enumerated procedural note in a municipal roll, records a woman suing over a loan she extended on grain. The clerk's shorthand reads, "The woman alone demands repayment and shows her instrument." The phrase "shows her instrument" is small but vital. It demonstrates that women not only had claims but could produce legal documents to support them. These small procedural steps made litigation, when necessary, a tool for protecting independent livelihoods. How did women translate legal rights into economic practice? Skills mattered: literacy, numeracy, and familiarity with bills and contracts. Many women acquired these skills through familial apprenticeship, daughters learning a trade at the shop of a parent, or through convent schooling and urban networks that provided reading and accounting instruction. Others learned practically on the street. Managing a stall requires inventory control, negotiation, and the ability to read market demand. Women who combined legal savvy with commercial skill could diversify income: textiles and brewing, small-scale credit and estate rents, making independence sustainable over years or decades. A striking example comes from textile towns, where female labor was central to production. In these places, a woman who controlled a set of looms could contract output to merchants, manage a workshop with journeymen and apprentices, and sell directly to buyers passing through town. Such women used a range of financial techniques: receiving payments in installments, accepting goods as partial payment, or leveraging communal funds to secure raw materials in bulk. These strategies are functionally similar to later forms of small-scale investment or cooperative credit, an analogy, not a direct equivalence, allowing women to reduce seasonal risk and smooth income. But none of this happened in a vacuum. Guilds and municipal authorities could be both gatekeepers and gateways. Some guilds admitted women. Widows commonly inherited their husband's guild rights or maintained categories that allowed female members to participate in limited ways. In other cities, guild restrictions tightened, channeling women into informal markets or forcing them to trade through male proxies. Scholars note regional variation. In some Flemish towns, women are visible in guild lists. In others, they are conspicuously absent and yet appear in the periphery of trade as subcontractors or household producers. Where guild restrictions constrained mobility, women leaned into other forms of collective economic organization. Which brings us to the Beguines, an innovation of particular interest. Beguine communities emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries across Low Countries and beyond, growing most visibly in textile and river towns. They were not convents in the strict sense. Members took no permanent vow and could, in theory, leave, nor were they simply informal households. Beguines occupied a middle ground. They lived together, maintained houses and workshops, engaged in charitable labor, and supported one another economically and socially. They developed rules for communal life, systems for distributing profits, and arrangements for taking in the poor or supporting members in old age. The economic scale of begging activity varied by town and over time. Some historians offer estimates based on surviving municipal records and convent inventories that suggest begging houses were major local employers in certain trades, particularly textiles, though counts vary and are debated. What's less disputed is their functional role. Beguines knitted together social welfare, production, and female autonomy in ways that made single life viable for women who did not want or could not secure a husband's protection. Daily life in a begging house combined labor, devotion, and care. A household inventory might list looms, dye vats, wool, cooking equipment, and liturgical books, a mix of the practical and the spiritual. In several towns, municipal records show begging workshops contracting with merchant firms, supplying cloth for export, or running hospice care that stood as a local social safety net. They were, in many towns, both economic actors and moral agents, providing services that city authorities sometimes relied upon when planning public welfare.
Yet their intermediate status made beguines vulnerable to suspicion. Clerical authorities and some chroniclers fretted over women living outside strict ecclesiastical oversight, and networks that allowed women to pool resources and decide autonomously could be recast as sites of moral danger. This tension between the practical benefits of female-led institutions and the anxiety they provoked among certain elites sets up one of the central dramas we will return to: autonomy judged as disorder. Returning to the marketplaces, we see similar ambivalence in how contemporaries described independent merchants.
One fragmentary merchant's account, a personal note jotted into a ledger, reads in one line, "Is it lawful that she keeps her own shop, and yet the customers come?" The shorthand captures the kernel of the matter. Courts and clerks could debate propriety, but demand made norms malleable. Customers visited who valued the quality of goods and the reliability of a seller, regardless of sex. Reputation, therefore, became critical. Women cultivated reputations for honesty, reliable delivery, and craftsmanship, social capital that could be translated into contracts and credit. How did independent women manage risk beyond reputation? Widows and single women often relied on diversification. Rather than depending on a single source of income, many combined brewing with cloth selling, lending with rental property, or house renting with cottage manufacturing. Property ownership was central to this strategy. A small house with a backroom workshop not only provided a workplace, but also collateral. Documents indicate women acquiring urban tenements, leasing plots for gardens, and investing in communal projects that paid dividends over years, a rudimentary version of asset management. We need to be cautious with modern labels. Calling these strategies entrepreneurial captures something of their dynamism, but it risks flattening important differences. The institutional context was medieval law, communal norms, and often a precarious subsistence economy. Yet the functional parallels are helpful. Women pooled resources, managed risk, and designed contracts. In some ways, it was an early form of household capitalism. Again, an analogy, not a direct transplantation of modern economic categories. The intersections of gender and law also shaped personal relations. Courtship could be a negotiation of property and status. Some women used prenuptial agreements, formal or informal, to protect property from being absorbed by a future husband. Others staged public contracts to make their financial independence clear. There is evidence of trial marriages, or agreed periods of cohabitation, that allowed both partners to assess compatibility before permanently altering property relations. These strategies demonstrate that independence was not merely the absence of men. It was an active set of choices about which relationships to enter and how to structure them. At this point, a careful reader might ask, how representative were these stories? Were women in the medieval world a significant economic force, or exceptional outliers? The truth is somewhere in between. Not every city had the legal flexibility or economic structure to support independent women, and class mattered enormously. Landed aristocrats, urban bourgeoisie, and rural peasants occupied different worlds.
Still, across a range of towns and regions, archival counts and municipal rolls indicate recurring patterns. Women appearing in lawsuits as creditors, widows stepping into their late husbands' roles, and communal houses providing social insurance. Scholarly estimates vary about scale, and where numbers are contested, we mark them as such. The aim here is to shift the narrative from women were universally dependent to there existed sustained, sometimes institutionally supported, forms of female autonomy that shaped medieval life. Let us close this first arc with a micro-story that illustrates how a single woman could use legal tools to defend both property and honor. A municipal record from a port town notes a dispute over a shipment of cloth. A woman who had financed the purchase accused a trading partner of failing to deliver and of attempting to seize her cargo. The court minutes, brief procedural entries, record that she presented witnesses, showed a contract, and ultimately secured a ruling that protected her financial stake. The entry is technical, the prose spare, but the implication is vivid. A woman, armed with documentation and social standing, went to court and defended her commercial interest on equal procedural terms. This is not a romantic tale of revolutionary feminism. It's a sequence of ordinary legal moves that add up to real power. That legal capacity created space for social experiments. In Genoa and Florence, widows of merchants sometimes acted effectively as heads of family firms, maintaining contacts across the Mediterranean and sending instructions to agents in foreign ports. In Antwerp and Bruges, women in quarters near the riverbank ran dye houses and spent evenings negotiating purchase agreements by lamplight. Across towns, women made ad hoc institutions, rotating savings clubs, neighborhood watches, and charitable funds that reduced vulnerability and expanded opportunity. Yet those expansions carried cultural risks. Autonomy invited scrutiny, and scrutiny could be weaponized.
The same mechanisms that allowed women to prosper, collective meetings, coded correspondence, and communal treasuries, could also be reinterpreted by rivals as conspiratorial or subversive. The languages used to describe independent women shifted over centuries, infecting how later chroniclers and lawyers remember them. Words like spinster and old maid emerged in contexts where single women were increasingly marginalized in rhetoric, if not universally in practice. We will return to the history of that semantic warfare, but for now the pattern is clear. Legal and economic possibility existed, and women translated those possibilities into concrete livelihoods. As we move forward, the story will take us from these private acts to collective forms, to beguine houses that organized production and care, to widows who styled themselves as patrons and diplomats, and to abbesses who ran schools and estates.
But already we can see the outlines of a paradox. Medieval institutions, law, guilds, and religious life both enabled and constrained female autonomy. Women learned to read those institutions, to bend them to their purposes, and to invent new social technologies where legal ones failed. The result was a patchwork of independence that left a trail in ledgers, petitions, and the occasional pithy line in a merchant's letter. The hidden lives we have started to uncover are not just subjects for nostalgic admiration. They complicate simple narratives about progress and dependency, showing instead how agency operates within constraint. They also set the stage for darker chapters, how language and medicine could be turned into instruments of control, how persecution targeted not only alleged witches, but the social networks that made independence possible, and how later historians and policymakers reshaped memory. Those threads will be important in the next section, where we step into the courtyard and the cloister to see how communal life and spiritual institutions both sheltered and amplified women's economic freedom. For now, remember the woman at the market who closed a deal and walked away with her ledger. Her life, bureaucratic, practical, sometimes joyful, illustrates the central truth of this story. Many medieval women deliberately built lives without men, assembling legal tools, economic strategies, and social networks to sustain themselves. That presence left traces that are sometimes faint, often contested, and periodically erased. What follows will probe those traces more deeply, into the workshops, the beguine courts, and the municipal chambers where everyday autonomy was negotiated and defended. Step into the cool shade of a beguine courtyard, flagged stones, a line of small houses, yarn drying on a rope between eaves, the faint clatter of a loom from behind a shuttered window. The air smells of soap and boiled cloth. The women speak softly across thresholds as they stitch, count, pray, and barter. This is not a convent, not quite a household of kin. This is a deliberate communal solution to a practical problem. Beguine houses knitted together production, care, and autonomy in a way that made life without a husband not merely survivable, but often prosperous and socially meaningful. Beguines occupied a persistent middle ground. They did not take perpetual vows. They kept freedom of movement and a degree of engagement with urban life that distinguished them sharply from cloistered nuns. Municipal records and inventories show beguine houses holding looms, dyeing vats, and stocks of cloth, assets that connected them directly to urban markets. One municipal inventory entry describes the goods of the house: looms, spun wool, and a chest of coins for the poor. A simple line, but one that stitches economic activity to communal care.
Scholarly estimates vary about scale. In some Flemish towns, beguine houses appear as major suppliers of cloth and hospice care. In others, they are smaller, more domestic operations. What is clear in the surviving paperwork is the combination of household-level production with a social welfare role that municipal authorities sometimes leaned on in times of crisis. Daily life inside a beguinage blended labor and mutual support. Women shared resources, raw materials bought in bulk, a joint fund for dowries or medical needs, a rotating schedule for caring for the sick. These arrangements reduced individual risk. If a single loom broke, the community could cover replacement. If a member suffered illness, the house's common chest could pay for care. Records that document communal treasuries, entries noting deposits and disbursements, reveal a practical financial architecture. One ledger notation preserved in a town roll reads in pared-down clerical Latin, "for the common chest of the sisters," a phrase that, stripped of romanticism, points to a proto-institutional device for mutual insurance. The economic reach of beguine houses extended beyond production into contractual life. Town councils sometimes contracted beguine workshops to supply linens or uniforms for hospitals. Merchant guilds occasionally purchased cloth produced by beguine-run workshops. Where municipal demand intersected with beguine capacity, women in these houses moved from household craftsmen to recognized urban producers. That shift altered their bargaining power. When a civic hospital relied on a beguine house for bedding, municipal officials were suddenly invested in the house's continuity. When a merchant urged bulk shipments, a beguine house entered trans-regional networks. These commercial interactions created bargaining chips.
social leverage that could be translated into legal recognition and political protection. But the very autonomy that made beguine houses productive also made them vulnerable to suspicion. Because they lived outside the strict control of male heads of household or monastic superiors, their gatherings, their decision-making, and their communal property were easy targets for moralizing critics. Ecclesiastical authorities, wary of lay women forming semi-religious communities, sometimes attempted to impose tighter oversight. Chroniclers, often male clerics, recorded beguines with a mixture of admiration for their charity and anxiety about their independence. That ambivalence between usefulness and suspicion would be a recurrent theme in the long arc that ends, in some places, with legal suppression. If beguine houses offered one form of collective independence, widowhood opened another. The widow was a legal figure of particular potency in medieval law and practice. When a husband died, property that had been controlled jointly or by him could revert to the widow in ways that gave her immediate economic leverage.
In many towns, the widow inherited the right to run her husband's shop, collect rents, and continue contractual obligations. For some women, widowhood was a moment of transition from being sheltered under a husband's legal identity to standing, sometimes for decades, as an independent economic actor. Consider as a representative archetype the widow who maintained a dye house and tenement properties. She collected rents from cottages she had expanded, she contracted with local weavers for raw wool, and she positioned her household as a node in a local distribution network. Records show widows using their dowry or late husband's capital to make loans, to finance new looms, and to endow almshouses, investments that secured both income and social prestige. In some cases, municipal rolls record women performing quasi-official acts, arbitrating neighbor disputes, financing road repairs, or donating to charitable projects that carried naming benefits in the town's memory. Those acts conferring local influence were not incidental. They formed a political economy in which the widow's purse translated into soft power. That soft power ranged from patronage to diplomacy. A noble or wealthy widow could, and often did, act as an interlocutor between families, towns, and even courts. In the Mediterranean cities, merchant widows sent instructions to agents in foreign courts. In northern towns, wealthy widows sometimes negotiated the terms of contracts that shaped whole craft sectors. Municipal records record women paying to maintain bridges or to endow a mass, actions that bound them into urban and ecclesiastical networks. These acts of patronage built reputations and often shields of protection. A town is less likely to move against an economically central household that supports its infrastructure. Abbeys and convents offer another, institutionalized pathway to female authority. Where a begging house was an informal communal solution, an abbey was an organized economic, educational, and healthcare institution. Abbesses managed sizable estates, administered rents from tenant farms, directed textile production, and oversaw schools that taught reading and some literacy to girls and young women. The economic footprint of large abbeys could rival that of local lords. They held lands, collected tithes, and engaged in leasing that required sophisticated accounting. Hildegard of Bingen stands as a striking example of the intellectual and administrative range some women could exercise. Her surviving letters and the administrative traces of her abbacy show an active manager involved in liturgical reform, the provisioning of her community, and the maintenance of networks that reached bishops and princes. The scale varies. Few abbesses wielded Hildegard's reach, but the institutional model mattered.
Convents trained women in bookkeeping, drug preparation, and, crucially, the habit of administration. Sustaining an estate required reading, reckoning, and the diplomacy of negotiating with tenants, bishops, and royal agents. Education within convent walls equipped women with tools many secular women did not have. The training to copy books or manage infirmaries built both technical skill and social capital. Medical knowledge, often housed in convent infirmaries, became a resource. Abbey infirmaries collected herbs and medical recipes, and abbesses sometimes negotiated with municipal authorities to provide care for the old and sick. Such arrangements made convents nodes of public welfare. Municipal authorities and local elites sometimes relied on convent-run hospitals or schools in ways that gave abbesses a measure of indirect political influence. These institutional forms, beguinage, widow-led households, abbey administration, were in practice supported by networks that extended beyond any single house. Women created practical linkages between towns, between households, and across kinship lines that functioned as lines of credit, information, and labor. Mutual aid took many operational forms. rotating savings funds, loan circles, shared procurement of raw materials, and even coded exchanges of letters that communicated prices and market opportunities. One preserved entry in a merchant ledger, short, bureaucratic, reads, "For the fund of sisters, paid for wool." The phrase is plain, but it reveals a mechanism, pooled capital used to smooth purchases. In other contexts, municipal petitions show neighborhoods appealing collectively for relief, or lists of donors to a common fund. These devices made risk-sharing systematic rather than ad hoc. Women, whether living in begonages, as widows, or as independent craftswomen, could rely on networks that functionally resemble cooperative finance, joint responsibility for loans, mutual guarantees, and community enforcement of reputation. Information flow was central. Letters, messengers, and personal introductions circulated market intelligence, price changes at port cities, demand for particular textiles, ship schedules. Women who maintained correspondence with agents in other towns used that information to time purchases, to seek better prices, and to coordinate shipments. Such cross-city ties were a form of capital, knowledge that allowed women to move goods beyond local markets and to leverage networks for credit and exchange. But rights, institutions, and networks do not exist in isolation from culture. Language, medical discourse, and legal rhetoric could be marshaled to undercut female autonomy. Over centuries, semantic shifts quietly reshaped how single women were perceived. Terms with neutral or technical origins, spinster as a person who spins, acquired connotations. Where a bachelor might connote youthful independence or a household head, spinster accrued a social penalty.
Linguistic change is not merely lexical, it shapes social imagination. When a common word for an occupation is recast as an insult, it participates in erasure. Medicalizations played a parallel role. Theories about women's bodies, ranging from humoral explanations to more elaborate pathologies, could transform a social behavior into a medical problem. A woman who preferred to live alone might be described in some medical tracts as subject to melancholy, wandering womb theories, or chlorosis. These diagnoses were not neutral clinical descriptions. They functioned as instruments in social argumentation, giving male physicians and clerics a seemingly scientific register to claim that female independence was unnatural or dangerous. Modern historians point out that the medical reframing of female behavior often served normative ends. It pathologized deviation from expected marital roles and provided justification for intervention. Legal and linguistic shifts converged with economic motives in the long, lethal sweep of witch hunting. When we talk about witch hunts, we must not reduce them to a single cause. Modern scholarship emphasizes multiple, sometimes intersecting drivers: religious reform and confessional conflict that sharpened anxieties about deviance, centralizing judicial regimes that channeled local accusations into formal trials, economic tensions in towns and villages where property disputes could transform into accusations, misogynistic cultural patterns that made women disproportionately vulnerable, and seasonal crises, famines, plagues that intensified scapegoating. At the practical level, persecution was also a mechanism of property transfer. In many places, the conviction of an accused witch was accompanied by the confiscation of property or fines paid to authorities. That created an incentive structure in which accusations could be exploited to redistribute assets. Municipal records sometimes show that after a conviction, local authorities appropriated the goods of the condemned. Here, again, we must be careful. It is an interpretive claim that economic motives sometimes intersected with religious and judicial zeal, not a blanket explanation. Records indicate varied local motives. In some towns, prosecutions were driven by genuine religious panic. In others, by inter-household conflicts or municipal greed. The archival pattern suggests a complex mixture. Court transcripts, where they survive, are chilling in their ordinariness. The accused, more often than not in many regions, an older woman of limited reliance on male protectors, stood before magistrates, endured interrogation, and often denied the charges. Many trial records simply record a protestation. The woman denied all dealings with the devil. That bare procedural note carries a human weight: denial, exhaustion, the possibility of torture, the cold efficiency of legal machinery.
Survivors' statements, when available, show communities rippling with the repercussions. Neighbors who had once traded with the accused were forced to recast those transactions as suspicious. The social capital that had previously allowed independent women to thrive could be transformed into incriminating evidence. The gendered geography of persecution is also instructive. Women who lived outside male households, Widows, beguines, single householders were disproportionately vulnerable to accusations that hinged on social difference. A woman who organized neighbors' funds, who met with other women to distribute alms, or who managed property might, in a town of rising fear, be reinterpreted as a locus of dangerous influence. That is not to assert a single reductionist motive. Rather, it highlights how multiple mechanisms, legal privilege, economic envy, patriarchal suspicion, could converge to erase independence. But persecution did not simply extinguish networks. In many regions, the knowledge women had accumulated, textile techniques, account-keeping practices, networks of trust, was transmitted forward. Some skills moved into male hands. In other cases, women adapted, settling into semi-legal or domestic niches that preserved competencies. The longer arc is one of partial survival. Practices reconfigured, institutions reduced, and certain forms of independence rendered less visible in official records. That invisibility is one reason these histories are hidden, not because they never existed, but because later legal and linguistic transformations muted their traces. The strategies independent women used to manage intimate relationships tell a parallel story of active negotiation rather than passive resignation. Courtship in medieval towns could be a careful contractual negotiation. Status, dowry, and legal consequences were explicit stakes. Some women insisted on prenuptial agreements, stipulating that their dowry remained separate property, or that certain assets be returned in the event of death. Trial marriages, periods of cohabitation agreed upon by households, appear in records as mechanisms for testing compatibility before committing to a legal tie that might alter property relations irrevocably. Salons and networks of friends functioned as informal vetting systems. A suitor brought before a circle of female acquaintances would be vetted not just for manners, but for creditworthiness and reliability. These practices reframed marriage for some women as a partnership rather than a subsumption. Women who had developed independent incomes brought bargaining power into marital negotiations. In cases where marriage threatened hard-won autonomy, some women preferred long-term singleness or negotiated quasi-partnerships that preserved property rights. These strategies complicate narratives that cast women's pre-modern lives as purely reactive. They show women designing social arrangements to preserve agency.
Financial intelligence sustained long-term autonomy. That intelligence had several dimensions. First, asset diversification. Independent women avoided putting all wealth into a single venture. A merchant matron might hold a plot of land, operate a small workshop, and keep a loan book. 3 partly independent income streams that reduced vulnerability to a single market collapse. Second, informal credit networks. Rotating funds, neighborhood lending, and personal sureties provided liquidity when formal banks were absent or closed to women. Third, contractual savvy. Women learned to write enforceable agreements, to secure witnesses, and to use municipal courts when contracts were breached. Those practices constituted a kind of vernacular financial literacy. A closer look at estate management reveals routine sophistication. Property leases were used to guarantee steady income. Urban tenements were valued not only for shelter but as reliable rents. Endowments to churches or hospitals could be structured to provide both public benefit and a durable reputation for the donor. Some women used philanthropic giving as a financial strategy. Endowing a chantry or repairing a bridge could buy political goodwill, soften rivals, and anchor a household's name in civic memory. Those were rational investments, the medieval equivalents of placing money into institutions that yield social dividends. International trade offered another mechanism for risk spreading. Women who participated in the Mediterranean or North Sea commerce used agents and partners to move goods and risk. Contracts with shipping merchants, letters of credit, and partnerships with mail carriers allowed women to enter markets beyond their immediate locale. These were not universal options. Most single women did not run transregional firms, but where they existed, they expanded opportunity and blurred the line between domestic and mercantile spheres. We must speak candidly about the limits of the record. Much of this evidence comes from courts, guild lists, account books, and letters. Sources such that unevenly and tend to privilege the literate and the relatively prosperous. Peasant women's strategies, for instance, are less visible in the archives and require different interpretive tools. Estimates of the number of beguines, of women in guilds, or of women who owned property are often contested. Where historians publish precise counts, they typically include caveats about archival survival and selective preservation. For that reason, whenever a precise number appears in older narratives, modern scholarship urges caution. Records can mislead as much as they illuminate. Our task is to weave threads from imperfect evidence into a plausible pattern, always marking doubt where it exists.
If there is a through line in these chapters, it is this. Autonomy was built through instruments, law, property, communal funds, education, and networks, and then contested through counter-instruments, semantic redefinition, medicalization, legal restriction, and sometimes violent repression. The cultural erasure that followed did not happen overnight. It was an accumulation, A few legal reforms here, a tightening of guild rules there, a linguistic shift in the public imagination, and, periodically, episodes of brutal suppression that removed both people and property from the visible landscape. So what survives, and what can modern readers reclaim from these hidden lives? There are fragments that carry forward. Account-keeping techniques persisted in household manuals and family ledgers passed down through generations. Neighborhood mutual aid, rotating saving clubs, survived in new forms and languages. Certain philanthropic patterns, endowing schools and hospitals, left physical traces and foundations with long legal afterlives. Even language holds recomposed memories. Surnames, marketplace names, and the names of endowed chapels carry hints of female benefaction, if one knows how to read them. Recovering these stories also requires an ethical historiography. We must be wary of romanticizing survival or creating a monocausal narrative of progress. Many women lived precarious lives. Many did not thrive by our measure. Yet the archival traces we do have, court documents in which women assert their rights, ledgers that record pooled funds, municipal correspondences that contract with beguine houses, demonstrate real practices of autonomy. They reveal tactics, legal savvy, financial diversification, the use of communal insurance, and strategic patronage. Those tactics are not quaint curiosities. They are practical adaptations to legal and social systems that offered both openings and constraints. There is a modern lesson here that is not teleological. The medieval story does not neatly map onto contemporary debates about entrepreneurship or individualism, but it does show that autonomy is not only an ideological position, it is a technical achievement. It requires institutions that recognize you, networks that support you, and rules that allow contracts to be enforced. When those institutional supports erode, autonomy becomes more dangerous. When they are robust, choice expands. The medieval example invites us to think institutionally about independence, to ask what legal forms, social practices, and networks sustain people who choose to live apart from traditional family structures. At the same time, the long arc of suppression, through language, medicine, law, and violence, warns us about the fragility of those supports. A change in rhetoric can shift public sympathy, a medical discourse can legitimize intervention, an economic crisis can convert envy into accusation.
The medieval experience teaches that liberties achieved in one generation can be undermined by slow, structural shifts. Remembering how verb and doctrine were weaponized against women then should make us cautious about how contemporary narratives can be used today. Before we close, return for a moment to the women themselves. The market woman with the ledger, the beguine adjusting a shuttle, the widow reading rent rolls by candlelight, the abbess dispatching letters across regions. Their lives were often ordinary in the best sense, comprised of careful transactions, neighborly obligations, and the slow accretion of skill. Their strategies were pragmatic and, at times, joyful. Craft communities that sang while they spun, networks that arranged festivals and supported funerals, houses that offered the elderly a place to sleep. To recover their history is to recover a wider sense of medieval social possibility. And so we return to the claim that frames this project, the hidden lives of women who thrived alone without to have a men. That awkward phrasing points to a central truth worth repeating plainly. Many medieval women deliberately and actively built lives without male partnership, in law, in market, in spiritual community, and in household governance. They did so by combining legal rights where available, financial ingenuity, communal insurance, and social networks. Their existence complicates any simple story of deference and dependence. It forces us to see the middle grounds, where agency was claimed and contested. At the same time, many of these lives were later recast, pathologized, or erased by changing language, institutional reforms, and at times by violence that stripped people of property and dignity. The erasure is political and cumulative. It affects what historians can find centuries later. Recovering these hidden lives demands patient reading of ledgers and court rolls, careful contextualization of medical and legal texts, and a willingness to hold interpretive uncertainty in view. If one takeaway remains, it is this: autonomy is built, defended, and sometimes dismantled. The medieval women we have followed were architects of small-scale institutions, beguine houses, savings funds, prenuptial contracts, retail reputations that made independence viable. Their techniques look familiar because basic problems of risk, credit, and partnership recur across time. The difference lies in the legal and cultural scaffolding available. The past shows possibilities and warns of fragility.
Thank you for following this exploration. If this story of hidden agency and quiet innovation surprised you, share what struck you most in the comments, where you're watching from, and which part of this history you want us to dig deeper into next. If you want the next hidden story, watch the next episode and let us know what surprised you most.